My name is Anna, and I never thought I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office at 26, discovering that everything I believed about my life was a carefully constructed lie. But let me start from the beginning, because the truth is so much stranger than fiction. Growing up, I always knew my grandfather Chester was different. Not different in a quirky, lovable way that you see in movies, but different in a way that made my stomach churn whenever I heard his voice booming through our family gatherings. Chester Kowalski was a man who commanded attention, demanded respect, and never, ever apologized for anything he did or said. My earliest memory of him was from when I was maybe 5 years old. I had spilled grape juice on his pristine white carpet during a family dinner at his massive estate in Westchester County, New York. While most grandparents might have laughed it off or helped clean up, Chester grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me so hard my teeth chattered. "You stupid, clumsy little brat," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "Do you have any idea how much this carpet cost? More than your parents make in 6 months." My mother, Sarah, tried to intervene, but Chester's cold gray eyes silenced her with a single glance. That was Chester's power. He could silence an entire room just by existing in it. As I grew older, I learned that Chester Kowalski wasn't just any grandfather. He was Chester Kowalski, the oil magnate who had built his fortune from nothing in the 1970s and 80s. His company, Kowalski Petroleum, was worth hundreds of millions, and Chester never let anyone forget it. Every conversation somehow circled back to his money, his success, his brilliance in business. "You know, Anna," he'd say during our monthly family dinners, "when I was your age, I was already working 16-hour days in the oil fields. I didn't have time for your generation's nonsense. Video games, social media, participation trophies. I earned everything I have." These speeches always made my parents uncomfortable. My father, David, would shift in his seat and change the subject, while my mother would force a smile and nod along, but I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way they gripped their wine glasses a little too tightly. The thing about Chester was that he had this uncanny ability to make everything about himself. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, his congratulations lasted exactly 30 seconds before he launched into a 20-minute story about how he dropped out of high school to work and still became more successful than any of those book-smart fools who stayed in school. When my younger brother Jake broke his arm playing baseball, Chester spent the entire hospital visit complaining about how much better healthcare was when he was young, and how modern doctors were just money-grabbing fraudsters who couldn't hold a candle to the real doctors of his generation. But it was during family tragedies that Chester's true nature really shone through. When my grandmother Helen, his own wife of 43 years, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, Chester's primary concern wasn't her well-being or her dignity. It was how her condition reflected on him. "I can't have people seeing her like this," he told my parents during a family meeting when I was 21. "It's embarrassing. What will my business associates think? What will the neighbors say?" My mother tried to reason with him. "Dad, she's your wife. She needs care. She needs love. She needs—" "What she needs," Chester interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "is to be somewhere where she won't embarrass this family anymore. I've already looked into some very nice facilities." That was when I first truly understood what kind of man my grandfather was. He put my grandmother in the most expensive memory care facility in the state, not because he wanted the best care for her, but because he wanted to be able to tell people he spared no expense. But he never visited her, not once in the 3 years before she died. At her funeral, Chester gave a speech that lasted 45 minutes. He talked about his own grief, his own loss, his own struggles with being a widower. He mentioned Helen exactly twice, and both times it was to describe how she'd supported his career ambitions. The entire speech was about Chester mourning Chester's loss. But Chester's narcissism wasn't just about demanding attention. It was about controlling every aspect of our family's life. He had opinions about everything: what colleges we should attend, what careers we should pursue, who we should marry, where we should live. And those opinions weren't suggestions. They were commands. When I announced that I wanted to major in social work, Chester lost his mind. "Social work?" he screamed, slamming his fist on his mahogany dining table so hard the wine glasses jumped. "Social work is for bleeding heart liberals who want to waste their lives helping people who are too lazy to help themselves. You're going to study business, and you're going to join my company, and you're going to make something of yourself." I tried to explain that I wanted to help disadvantaged children, that I felt called to make a difference in their lives. But Chester wasn't listening. He never listened when someone else was talking. "Called?" he scoffed. "The only thing you should feel called to do is continue this family's legacy. I built Kowalski Petroleum from nothing, and I'll be damned if my granddaughter wastes her life on charity work." When I refused to change my major, Chester cut off my college funding. Just like that. My parents tried to help, but they didn't have the kind of money needed for a private university. I had to take out massive student loans and work 3 jobs to get through school. But even that wasn't enough punishment for Chester. He made sure to remind me at every family gathering exactly how much money I was throwing away on my worthless degree. "Do you know how much debt you'll be in when you graduate?" he'd ask in front of the entire extended family. "Do you know how long it'll take you to pay that back on a social worker's salary? You could have had everything handed to you, but you chose to be stubborn and stupid." The worst part wasn't the financial struggle. It was watching how Chester's behavior affected the rest of our family. My parents walked on eggshells around him, terrified of saying anything that might set him off. My younger brother Jake had developed this nervous tic where he'd stutter whenever Chester was around. And my Aunt Linda, Chester's daughter, had started bringing a flask to family gatherings and would sneak sips throughout the evening. Chester seemed to feed off our discomfort. The more tense we became, the more satisfied he looked. It was like he enjoyed watching us squirm under his control. The breaking point came during Christmas of 2023. I had just gotten engaged to my boyfriend of 3 years, Marcus, who worked as a teacher at an inner-city elementary school. Marcus was everything I could have wanted in a partner: kind, funny, passionate about helping kids, and completely supportive of my career in social work. But Chester took one look at Marcus and decided he wasn't good enough for his granddaughter. "A teacher?" Chester said, not even trying to hide his disgust. "What does a teacher make, 30,000 a year? 40? You might as well marry a janitor." Marcus, to his credit, tried to be polite. "Actually, sir, I make 52,000, and teaching is incredibly rewarding work. I love helping children reach their potential." Chester laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that made everyone in the room flinch. "Potential?" he sneered. "The only potential that matters is earning potential. You'll never be able to provide for Anna the way she deserves. You'll never be able to give her the life I could give her if she'd just stop being so goddamn stubborn." I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger. "Grandpa, that's enough. Marcus is a wonderful man, and he's a loser," Chester interrupted. "Just like you're becoming. I offered you everything, Anna. A place in my company, a salary that would make your little boyfriend's annual income look like lunch money, a chance to actually matter in this world. But you chose to throw it all away for what? To help a bunch of welfare brats who'll probably end up in prison anyway?" That's when something inside me snapped. All the years of his belittling, his controlling behavior, his complete inability to see anyone else as a human being with their own dreams and values, it all came crashing down on me at once. "You know what, Grandpa?" I said, standing up from the dinner table. "I'd rather be a loser who actually cares about other people than a bitter, selfish old man who only loves himself." The room went dead silent. Chester's face turned purple with rage, and for a moment, I thought he might have a heart attack. But instead, he did something I never expected. He slapped me. It wasn't a gentle slap or a warning tap. It was a full-force, open-handed slap that sent me stumbling backward and left a burning handprint on my cheek. The sound echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. "How dare you?" he whispered, his voice shaking with fury. "How dare you speak to me like that, you ungrateful little bitch?" My mother gasped and started crying. My father jumped up and stepped between Chester and me. Marcus was on his feet too, his hands clenched into fists. But Chester wasn't done. "You want to know what you just cost yourself?" he continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "I'm worth $245 million, Anna, and you were going to inherit a third of it. But not anymore. Not after tonight. You're cut off, completely and permanently. You'll never see a penny of my money." He turned to address the rest of the family. "And that goes for anyone who continues to associate with her. You're either with me, or you're with the ungrateful brat who thinks she knows better than the man who built this family's fortune." I grabbed Marcus's hand and headed for the door, my cheek still burning from the slap. But Chester's voice followed me. "Don't come crawling back when reality hits, Anna. Don't come begging for forgiveness when you realize what you've thrown away." because I'll never forgive you for this. Never. That was the last time I spoke to my grandfather Chester. It was also the last time I spoke to most of my family. True to his word, Chester made them choose, and most of them chose his money over their relationship with me. The next few months were some of the darkest of my life. The isolation was crushing. Suddenly losing your entire extended family overnight does something to your soul that I can't quite describe. Marcus was wonderful, and my parents tried to stay in touch, but they were walking a tightrope, terrified that Chester would cut them off too if he found out. But slowly I started to rebuild. I threw myself into my work at the Children's Advocacy Center where I'd gotten a job after graduation. I was helping kids who'd been removed from abusive homes, and every day I saw the damage that narcissistic, controlling parents could do to innocent children. In a strange way, my experience with Chester gave me insight into what these kids were going through. Marcus and I got married in a small ceremony with just a few close friends and my immediate family. It wasn't the big wedding I'd dreamed of as a little girl, but it was perfect in its simplicity and love. 2 years passed. Marcus and I bought a small house in Albany, and I was promoted to senior caseworker. Life was good, if not exactly easy financially. We talked about starting a family, about the kind of parents we wanted to be, about breaking the cycle of dysfunction that had plagued my family for generations. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, I got a phone call that changed everything. "Miss Kowalski?" The voice on the other end was professional, clinical. "This is Patricia Rodriguez from the law firm of Morrison, Klein & Associates. I need to speak with you about your grandfather's estate." My heart stopped. Is Chester dead? I'm afraid so. He passed away 3 days ago from a massive heart attack. I'm calling because you're mentioned in his will, and we need to schedule a meeting to discuss the terms. I was stunned. After 2 years of complete silence, after being publicly disowned and cut off, Chester had still mentioned me in his will? Part of me wondered if this was some final cruel joke. Maybe he'd left me $1 just to make one last statement about how little I meant to him. But Patricia's next words made my blood run cold. "Miss Kowalski, there are some unusual circumstances surrounding your inheritance that require immediate attention. Can you be at our office tomorrow at 2 p.m.? And please don't discuss this with anyone until we've met." The law office of Morrison, Klein & Associates was exactly what you'd expect from a firm that handled multi-million-dollar estates. Marble floors, mahogany paneling, and an atmosphere of serious money. Patricia Rodriguez was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her massive desk. "Before we begin, I need to ask you some questions about your family history." She opened a thick file and pulled out several documents. "Anna, what do you know about your adoption?" I blinked, confused. My adoption? I wasn't adopted. My parents are David and Sarah Kowalski. Chester was my grandfather. Patricia's expression didn't change. "According to the documents in your grandfather's personal safe, you were adopted as an infant. These are the original papers." She slid a manila folder across the desk to me. With trembling hands, I opened it and found myself staring at adoption documents dated 26 years ago. My name, my birth date, my parents' signatures. It was all there in black and white. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Why wouldn't they tell me? Why would they keep this secret?" "That's not the unusual part," Patricia said quietly. "Anna, according to these documents and the private investigator's report that your grandfather commissioned last year, you weren't voluntarily given up for adoption. You were kidnapped as a baby." The words hit me like a physical blow. The room started spinning, and I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from falling over. "Kidnapped?" I managed to croak. Patricia nodded grimly. "Your biological parents, Robert and Maria Santos, have been searching for you for 26 years. You were taken from your crib when you were 3 months old. The case was never solved, and it destroyed their marriage. They divorced 5 years after you disappeared. I felt like I was going to vomit. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my identity, my family, it was all built on a lie. But how could this be possible? How could my parents, the people who raised me, be involved in something so horrible? How? I asked, my voice barely audible. How did this happen? Patricia pulled out another document. "According to your grandfather's notes and the investigator's findings, your father, David Kowalski, was involved in some questionable business dealings in the 90s. He owed money to some very dangerous people. When Sarah couldn't get pregnant after years of trying, someone approached David with a proposition. They could make his debt disappear and provide him with a healthy baby girl. No questions asked. David and Sarah believed they were adopting a baby whose teenage mother couldn't care for her. They had no idea that you had been stolen from your real parents. They processed the adoption through a corrupt attorney who has since been disbarred and died in prison for human trafficking charges. I couldn't breathe. My entire life was based on a crime. The people I called Mom and Dad were, technically, accessories to kidnapping, even if they didn't know it at the time. But Chester knew? I asked. Patricia's face hardened. Your grandfather found out the truth about 18 months ago. He hired a private investigator to look into your background because he was considering changing his will. The investigator uncovered the whole story. And he never told anyone? He never tried to reunite me with my real parents? No, Patricia said. In fact, according to his private notes, he saw this information as leverage. He believed that if you ever found out the truth, it would destroy your relationship with David and Sarah, and you'd have nowhere to turn except back to him. I felt a rage building inside me, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Even in death, Chester was still trying to manipulate and control me. He'd discovered that my entire life was built on a lie, and instead of doing the right thing, he'd planned to use that information to force me back into his orbit. There's more, Patricia continued. Your grandfather's will is unusual. He's left his entire estate to you, with some very specific conditions. She pulled out the will and began reading. To my granddaughter Anna Kowalski, I leave my entire estate, valued at approximately $245 million, under the following conditions. First, she must legally change her name back to Anna Santos and publicly acknowledge her true parentage. Second, she must cut all contact with David and Sarah Kowalski, the people who unknowingly participated in her kidnapping. Third, she must use a portion of her inheritance to compensate her biological parents for their 26 years of suffering. I stared at her in disbelief. He's still trying to control me, even from the grave. It appears so, Patricia agreed. But Anna, there's something else you need to know. Your biological father, Robert Santos, has been looking for you his entire adult life. He never remarried, never had other children. Finding you has been his sole purpose for 26 years. She pulled out a photograph and handed it to me. It showed a man in his 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, holding a picture of a baby. Me, apparently. Even across 26 years and through the pain of loss, I could see something familiar in his face. Something that looked like home. He lives about 3 hours from here, Patricia continued. He owns a small restaurant in Buffalo. When we contacted him yesterday to tell him you'd been found, he broke down crying. He wants to meet you, but he understands if you need time to process all of this. I sat in that leather chair for what felt like hours, trying to wrap my mind around everything I'd learned. My grandfather, the man who'd slapped me and disowned me for standing up to his bullying, had discovered the truth about my kidnapping and planned to use it as a weapon to force me back under his control. The parents who raised me had unknowingly built their family on a crime. And somewhere in Buffalo, a man I'd never met had spent 26 years mourning a daughter he thought he'd never see again. What happens if I don't accept the conditions of the will? I asked. Then the money goes to various charities that your grandfather specified. But Anna, you should know that regardless of the inheritance, your biological parents have the right to know what happened to their daughter. This isn't just about money. It's about justice for a crime that was committed against them and against you. That night, I went home to Marcus and told him everything. We sat at our kitchen table until 3 a.m, talking through all the implications, all the emotions, all the impossible decisions I was facing. What do you want to do? Marcus asked, holding my hands across our small wooden table. I want to meet him, I said without hesitation. I want to meet Robert Santos. I need to know where I came from, who I really am. But the money, the conditions. I don't know if I can do what Chester wants me to do. You don't have to do anything Chester wants, Marcus said firmly. He's dead. His opinions don't matter anymore. What matters is what you think is right. The next morning, I called Patricia and asked her to arrange a meeting with Robert Santos. 2 days later, I was driving to Buffalo with Marcus beside me, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as we pulled up in front of a small family restaurant called Santos Kitchen. The moment I walked through the door, I knew, even without seeing a picture, even without any context, I would have known that Robert Santos was my father. We had the same eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of tilting our heads when we were thinking. When he saw me, he stopped dead in his tracks. The coffee cup in his hand slipped and shattered on the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. Tears started streaming down his face as he whispered, "Sophia? Sophia?" I repeated. "That's what we named you," he said, his voice breaking. "Sophia Maria Santos. We called you our little Sophia." For the next 6 hours, Robert told me about my life before I was taken, about how much he and my biological mother Maria had wanted me, how they'd tried for years to have a baby before I was born, about the nursery they'd painted yellow because they wanted to be surprised by my gender, about the night I was taken, how they'd put me down to sleep and woken up to find my crib empty and the window open. "The police said it was probably someone who couldn't have children," he explained, wiping his eyes with a napkin from his restaurant. "They said whoever took you probably loved you and was taking care of you. That was the only thing that kept me sane, thinking that maybe you were somewhere safe and happy." He told me about the years of searching, the private investigators, the false leads, the slow breakdown of his marriage to Maria as the grief consumed them both. "She couldn't handle it," he said sadly. "Every day was a reminder of what we'd lost. We divorced when you would have been 5, but we stayed in touch. We both kept looking. She remarried eventually, has 2 stepchildren now, but she never forgot you. Neither of us ever forgot you." As I listened to Robert's story, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the sensation of puzzle pieces clicking into place. All my life, I'd felt slightly out of sync with the Kowalski family. I'd always been more empathetic, more interested in helping others, more sensitive to injustice. David and Sarah were good people, but they were passive, conflict avoidant. Chester had always made them uncomfortable, but they never stood up to him the way I eventually did. But sitting in that restaurant, listening to Robert talk about his passion for social justice, his volunteer work with missing children organizations, his belief that everyone deserved dignity and respect, I understood where my values came from. I understood why I'd been so drawn to helping vulnerable children, why Chester's selfishness and cruelty had affected me so deeply. "What about Maria?" I asked. "My biological mother?" Robert's face softened. "She lives in California now. She's a nurse practitioner, works with low-income families. When I called to tell her we'd found you, she cried for 2 hours straight. She wants to meet you, but she's also terrified. She spent so many years imagining this moment, wondering what you'd be like, whether you'd hate us for not protecting you." "I could never hate you for that," I said immediately. "You were victims too." We talked until the restaurant closed, and then we sat in the empty dining room talking for another 3 hours. Robert showed me photo albums he'd kept of my first 3 months of life, pictures I'd never seen, moments from my infancy that the Kowalskis had never been able to share because they didn't exist in their version of my history. When I finally said goodbye, Robert hugged me tight and whispered, "I never stopped believing I'd find you, Sophia. Not one single day." Driving home, Marcus and I were both quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked, "So what are you going to do about the inheritance?" I'd been thinking about that question for hours. Chester's will was clearly designed as one final attempt to control me from beyond the grave. He'd structured it so that accepting the money would require me to destroy my relationship with the only parents I'd ever known, even though they were innocent victims in this whole situation. But there was something Chester hadn't anticipated, something that revealed just how little he'd understood about who I really was. "I'm going to accept the inheritance," I said, "but not because of Chester's conditions. I'm going to accept it because that money can do a lot of good in the world. And I'm going to use it to help other families who've been through what the Santos family went through." Over the next few weeks, I worked with Patricia to navigate the complex legal and emotional landscape of my situation. I legally changed my name to Anna Santos Kowalski, acknowledging both my biological and adoptive families. I reached out to David and Sarah and told them everything I'd learned. Their reaction was everything I'd hoped it would be. They were devastated to learn the truth about my adoption, horrified that they'd unknowingly been part of a crime, but completely supportive of my relationship with Robert and my eventual meeting with Maria. "We always knew you were special," Sarah said through her tears. "We never questioned why you came into our lives. We were just grateful. But knowing what your real parents went through, God, Anna, how do we even begin to make that right? You don't, I told her. You loved me, and raised me, and gave me everything I needed to become who I am. You're not responsible for what happened before I came to you. I refused to cut contact with David and Sarah, which technically meant I was violating Chester's will conditions. But Patricia found a loophole. The will stated that I had to cut all contact with them, but it didn't specify a time frame. I could accept the inheritance and then resume contact later. But more importantly, I realized I didn't care about Chester's conditions. He was dead, and his attempts to control me died with him. I used the first $1 million of my inheritance to establish the Sofia Santos Foundation, dedicated to helping families of missing children and supporting organizations that work to prevent child trafficking. The foundation's first major donation went to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I also set up a generous trust fund for Robert and Maria, not because Chester's will demanded it, but because it was the right thing to do. They'd lost 26 years with their daughter, and while money couldn't give them back that time, it could ensure they never had to worry about financial security again. Robert tried to refuse the money at first. I don't want your grandfather's blood money, he said. I just want my daughter back. It's not his money anymore, I told him. It's mine now, and I get to decide what to do with it. Besides, you and Maria deserve compensation for what you went through. You deserve to be able to retire comfortably, to travel, to enjoy the life you couldn't have while you were searching for me. Eventually he accepted, and used part of the money to expand his restaurant and hire more people from the community. If I'm going to have money I never expected, he said, I might as well use it to help other people too. Meeting Maria was even more emotional than meeting Robert. She flew out from California 3 months after my first meeting with Robert, and the moment she saw me, she collapsed. I'd never seen an adult cry like that. Deep, primal sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond grief. I'm sorry, she kept saying through her tears. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to keep looking. I'm sorry I gave up. You didn't give up, I told her, holding her while she cried. You survived. You built a life. You helped other people. That's not giving up. That's heroic. Maria stayed for 2 weeks, and we spent every day together. She told me about my biological grandparents, who died while I was missing, never knowing what happened to their granddaughter. She showed me pictures of aunts and uncles and cousins I'd never known I had. She taught me to make traditional Mexican dishes that she'd planned to pass down to me. Your abuela always said you had wise eyes, Maria told me one evening as we cooked together in Marcus's and my kitchen. Even as a baby, you looked at the world like you understood something the rest of us didn't. I think that's why you became a social worker, why you help children. Even though you didn't know your own story, you somehow knew that children need protection. The most surprising part of this whole experience was how naturally Robert and Maria fit into my life. There was no awkward adjustment period, no sense that we were strangers trying to force a relationship. They felt like family immediately, in a way that was different from but complementary to my relationship with David and Sarah. Marcus loved them too. Your biological parents are amazing, he told me one night after Robert and Maria had both gone home. But you know what I love most about this whole situation? You didn't let Chester win. He tried to use this information to control you, and instead, you used it to build something beautiful. 6 months after Chester's death, I was featured in a magazine article about my foundation and my story. The headline read, "From Kidnapped Baby to Millionaire Philanthropist, How One Woman Turned Family Tragedy into Hope for Others." But the real victory wasn't the money or the public recognition. It was the phone call I received on a Tuesday morning from a woman named Jennifer in Oregon. "Anna," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "I saw your story in the magazine. My daughter was kidnapped 15 years ago, and I never stopped looking, but I was starting to lose hope. Your story reminded me that miracles can happen, that families can be reunited even after decades. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for showing me that it's not too late." 3 months later, Jennifer's daughter was found living under a false identity in Nevada. The Sofia Santos Foundation paid for their reunion and counseling, and Jennifer sent me a photo of her and her daughter together for the first time in 15 years. That's when I knew that Chester, in his twisted, selfish way, had actually given me the greatest gift possible. His cruelty and narcissism had driven me away from his toxic influence. His death and his manipulative will had led me to discover my true identity and reunite with parents who'd never stopped loving me. And his fortune was now being used to heal other families torn apart by similar tragedies. Looking back now, I can see that Chester never understood what he was dealing with. He thought love was about control, that family was about power, and money, and obligation. He thought he could manipulate me the same way he'd manipulated everyone else in our family for decades. But Chester never realized that the values that made me stand up to him, empathy, justice, genuine care for others, those weren't weaknesses to be exploited. They were strengths that would ultimately defeat everything he represented. The last time I visited Chester's grave, I brought flowers, not for him, but for the grandmother Helen he'd abandoned in her time of need. As I placed the bouquet on her headstone next to his, I said a quiet thank you. Thank you for showing me who I never wanted to become. Thank you for pushing me away from your toxicity before it could poison me too. And thank you for leaving me the resources to turn your legacy of selfishness into something that actually helps people. Chester Kowalski spent his whole life accumulating money and power, but he died alone, bitter, and ultimately powerless to control the granddaughter who'd had the courage to walk away from his offer of everything. In the end, his greatest fear came true. He was forgotten by the people who mattered, while his money went to causes he would have despised. But Robert and Maria Santos, who'd lost everything that mattered to them and spent 26 years never giving up hope, found their way back to love, family, and healing. Today, Marcus and I have 2 children, David Santos Kowalski, named after my adoptive father, and Sophia Maria Santos Kowalski, named after my biological grandmother, and the woman who never stopped believing she'd find her stolen daughter. Both kids know their whole story, all 4 of their grandparents, and the importance of using whatever resources they have to help others. And sometimes, when I'm reading bedtime stories to my children in the house we bought with Chester's money, I think about how different things might have been if he'd chosen love over control, empathy over ego, family over fortune. But then I remember that his failures led to my greatest blessings, and I'm grateful that some stories have happy endings even when they begin with the worst kind of tragedy. Do you agree with my decision to accept Chester's inheritance but ignore his controlling conditions? Please subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed this story, and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to let toxic people define who you become, even when they're family.